The first time I understood what my family really was, I was sitting in the vice principal's office watching a girl I barely knew get accused of cheating on an exam she had almost certainly aced without help. Her name was Eleanor Blackwood, and she sat across the desk from Vice Principal Carson with her hands folded in her lap, not trembling, not crying, just still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from practice. From a long education in absorbing things you can't fight without making them worse. The cheat sheet they found in her bag was handwritten. 3 pages of dense formula notes for an AP chemistry exam. The handwriting wasn't hers. I knew that immediately because I had seen her handwriting on the board once. During a group presentation, hers was angular, almost architectural. These notes were looping and careless. They had been written quickly by someone who didn't need them and knew it. I knew whose handwriting it was. I sat outside that office because I had been called as a witness. Tyler Chambers had told Carson he'd seen Eleanor pull something from her bag mid-exam. I was sitting 2 rows behind her. I had seen nothing of the kind, and I knew Tyler hadn't either, because Tyler had spent most of that exam carving his initials into the corner of his desk with a mechanical pencil. What I didn't know yet, sitting in that plastic chair in the hallway, was that the note was Tyler's, that he and Gavin Powell had written it the night before and slipped it into her chemistry textbook before first period. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew that what was happening inside that office was wrong. I also knew that if I walked in there and said so, my life at Thornfield Academy, every connection, every social architecture I had spent 4 years maintaining, would collapse around me in a matter of days. I told you this story would have a moment where I stood up. I want you to understand what it cost before I get there. And I want you to understand what it made possible, because 12 years later, I sat across a conference table from my father's board of directors and removed him from operational control of a company he had spent 30 years building. I did it legally, strategically, and without raising my voice, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My father's name doesn't matter. What matters is what he represented. Money old enough to have its own gravity. The kind of family where reputation is maintained like infrastructure, constantly, invisibly, expensively. I was raised inside expectations I had never been asked to consent to. Private school since kindergarten, summers abroad, the right friends, the right activities, the right handshake, the right tie. My father reviewed my class schedules. My mother approved my social circle with the kind of casual authority usually reserved for board meetings. I was not unhappy exactly. I had never had a reference point for what happiness, separate from that structure, might feel like. I was compliant in the way that children raised in controlled environments become compliant, not because they agree, but because disagreement costs too much too fast to sustain. At Thornfield, I existed near the top of the social hierarchy not because I was particularly charismatic or clever, but because of what my last name implied. Tyler Chambers, Gavin Powell, Chad Gibson, Oliver Sanderson. These were my people by assignment more than by affection. We played the same sports, attended the same parties, complained about the same teachers. It was efficient, that friendship, almost professional. Eleanor Blackwood was none of that. She had transferred junior year under circumstances that immediately became social currency. Her father's company, a mid-sized logistics firm, was under preliminary investigation for misallocated municipal contracts. It hadn't gone to trial. Nothing had been proven, but in the economy of a prep school, preliminary was enough. She arrived labeled. She sat in the back. She ate lunch alone or with a girl named Valerie Rivera who had her own complicated social position. She got near perfect grades and said almost nothing in class. I noticed her the way I noticed most things I was not supposed to notice, carefully, without expression, from a distance. What I noticed was that she didn't perform smallness the way people in her position usually did. She didn't hunch. She didn't apologize with her posture. She sat straight, answered when called on, and absorbed the whispers and the pointed laughter around her, with a face that revealed nothing. I had watched Tyler drop a crumpled paper ball onto her lunch tray once and walk away laughing. She had looked at it for a moment, then set it on the table beside her and continued eating. I said nothing. I kept my face neutral and turned back to my own table. I tell you that so you understand. I was not a hero before that office. I was a bystander, with excellent social instincts and a thorough understanding of what things cost. The day they planted the notes, I was not in on it. That was not virtue. It was proximity. Tyler and Gavin had handled it during the free period I'd spent in the library. I walked into the exam room, knowing nothing, took my seat, and watched Eleanor take out her textbook to review her notes, the way she always did before an exam started. I watched the exam proctor walk toward her 3 minutes in. I watched Eleanor's face go through something I couldn't name. Not guilt, not fear exactly. More like a kind of weary recognition, as if she had been waiting for something like this, had always known something like this was coming. They walked her out. The exam continued. Tyler caught my eye across the room and made a small, satisfied expression that I recognized as the face of someone who has successfully completed a plan. That was the moment I knew, and I sat there through 50 more minutes of chemistry questions understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I had a choice in front of me. Not a comfortable one, not a clean one. I went to Carson's office after the exam ended. I told him I had been sitting near Tyler during the first period that day, and that Tyler had been writing on loose paper with a red pen. I told him I had seen Gavin leave for the bathroom before first period, with Eleanor's backpack on the hook outside, and that it had taken him 7 minutes. I told him that I would be happy to provide a written statement. I did not tell him I knew with certainty what had happened. I gave him what I had observed, precisely and factually, and let the logic complete itself. Carson looked at me for a long moment. He asked if I understood what I was saying. I told him yes. Eleanor was cleared by 4 o'clock. Tyler and Gavin received 2-week suspensions, and by the time I got to school the next morning, the social consequences of what I had done were already fully assembled and waiting for me. Chad stopped talking to me first, then Oliver. Tyler's suspension meant I didn't have to see his face directly for 2 weeks, but I heard through the remaining connected tissue of our friend group what he'd said about me. The words were predictable. Traitor featured prominently. So did worse things, the kind of language designed to make you feel small without technically crossing a line. I sat alone at lunch. I got excluded from the group chat. I walked past my old table and no one looked up. I want to be clear about something. I had expected this. I had sat in that plastic chair outside Carson's office and run the calculation and done it anyway. But expecting a cost and paying it are different experiences. The isolation was real. The cafeteria is large when you're in it alone. The hallways are long. The days are long. Eleanor found me in the library 3 days later. She sat across from me without asking permission, opened her textbook, and said without looking up, "You didn't have to do that." I told her I knew. She looked at me then, just for a moment, and then she nodded once, like we had reached an agreement about something, and went back to reading. That was how it started. We didn't date, not at first. We talked. In the library, in the courtyard, in the 20 minutes before the first bell, when most students were still arriving. She was, I realize now, the first genuinely uncalculated friendship I'd ever had. There was nothing strategic in it. There was no social dividend. It was just 2 people who found each other interesting under circumstances that required honesty. She told me about the investigation into her father's company. She described it without drama, a preliminary inquiry, procedural irregularities, nothing charged. Her father had hired attorneys. The family had moved to reduce costs. She had transferred schools. She said all of it the way she said most things, directly, without asking. For sympathy, which paradoxically made me feel more sympathetic than anything else might have. I told her about my family, less directly at first, but she was patient and precise in the way that people who process a lot of information quietly tend to be, and she asked the right questions. By November, she knew more about my interior life than anyone else on the planet. Somewhere in there, it became something else. I don't have a clean moment for when. I know that one afternoon in December, I drove her home after a study session, and she said something that made me laugh. Genuinely laugh, not the social performance of laughter I was accustomed to producing. And I sat in the parking lot outside her apartment building for a minute after she went in, just sitting with how different that felt. We were careful, not because I was ashamed of her. I want to be very precise about that. I was not ashamed of Eleanor Blackwood. I was afraid of my parents. Those are different things. My mother had social radar that could triangulate a threat from 3 social circles away. I knew that if she learned I was spending time with the daughter of a family under investigation, a family she had once, in passing, described as connected to that logistics trouble in a way that suggested familiarity, the response would not be simple disappointment. It would be strategic intervention. So we were quiet about it. We met in places my parents' network didn't monitor. We told no one. We were, for about 4 months, successfully invisible. Then my mother ran into a friend who had seen us at a coffee shop in December. My father called me into his study on a Thursday evening in February. My mother sat in the chair to his left, which was unusual. She generally positioned herself peripherally during correction conversations, present but deniable. That she was sitting directly in my sight line told me the conversation had been coordinated. He said Eleanor's name the way people say something they've researched, carefully, with full information available behind the word. He told me he was aware I had been spending time with her. He said he wanted me to understand the full context of the Blackwood family situation before I made any decisions that might reflect on our family's position. He used phrases like business environment and reputational adjacency. He spoke for 11 minutes without asking me a single question. Then he told me it was going to stop. I told him it wasn't. My mother's expression didn't change. My father looked at me the way he looked at things that had failed to follow expected procedures, with a kind of administrative displeasure, like a document that had been filed incorrectly. He said, "You should think carefully about what you're choosing." I said I had. He nodded slowly and told me I could go. I went upstairs. I didn't sleep. I went through the conversation 12 times, looking for what I had missed, what lever he hadn't pulled yet, what consequence he'd implied without stating. My father did not make idle statements. When he said think carefully, he had already thought carefully. He was telling me there were options he had not yet deployed. I didn't understand what that meant until April. Eleanor called me at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in April and asked if I could meet her. The edge in her voice was something I'd never heard before. Not panic, Eleanor didn't panic, but something close to controlled alarm, the voice of someone processing information too large for their current framework. I met her in the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks from her apartment. She was in her coat over pajama pants, her hair loose, holding her phone in both hands like it might do something unexpected. She told me that her father's attorney had called that afternoon. The investigation, the one that had been moving slowly, nearly dormant for over a year, had been reopened. New documentation had been submitted to the relevant agency by a third party. An affiliated audit firm had been engaged. Her father's accounts had been frozen pending review. She said, "My father thinks this isn't a coincidence." She said, "He thinks someone triggered this deliberately." She looked at me then, not with accusation, she was too precise for unfounded accusation, but with a question she was giving me the opportunity to answer voluntarily. I told her I didn't know anything. I didn't. I had no information, no confirmation, but I felt, in that parking lot, an icy and very specific dread settle into my chest, because my father did not make idle statements, and he had asked me to think carefully about what I was choosing. I held her hands and told her we would figure it out. I meant it. I had no idea yet what figuring it out would require. 3 weeks later, Eleanor told me she was leaving. She said it the way she said hard things, directly, without preamble, looking at me steadily. She said her family needed to relocate, that the pressure of the investigation had become untenable, that her father had been advised to reduce visibility. She said she didn't want to tell me where they were going, not because she didn't trust me, but because she didn't trust the ecosystem around me. She said she needed distance from anything connected to my family's sphere. She said, "I don't know if this was your parents, but I know you can't stop it. And I know staying close to you right now is a risk I can't afford to take on behalf of my family." She was not unkind about it. She was not cruel. She was Eleanor, precise, careful, protecting what she could protect, accepting what she couldn't change. I didn't argue. I wanted to. I wanted to tell her I would fix it, that I would confront my father, that there would be consequences. But I was 17 years old with no money, no leverage, no power whatsoever, and I had seen what my family could do when they decided something needed to be resolved. She left 12 days later. She didn't tell me where. I didn't ask again. Senior year was the loneliest year of my life. I had no friends from my old circle. My relationship with my parents had calcified into a polite, load-bearing silence. I attended class, completed assignments, played my sport, showed up where required. On the surface, nothing was visibly wrong. That was its own particular misery, the performance of normalcy over a completely hollowed interior. I told my father once that I believed he had engineered the reopening of the investigation. He looked at me without surprise, and said that he had done what was necessary to protect the family's interests. He said it with the same flat administrative certainty he used for everything. He did not confirm a specific mechanism. He did not deny the broader truth. He told me that when I was older, I would understand that sentiment was a luxury that people in their position could not afford. I told him that I understood perfectly. I told him I intended to build a position where I didn't have to make the same choices. He considered this and nodded, as if I had said something sensible. I don't think he heard the threat in it. I'm not sure it was fully formed as a threat yet, in my own understanding. But something settled into place that day, a long, cold determination that had no immediate object and no immediate timeline, but was very much present. I noted it. I filed it somewhere internal. I kept going. I graduated. I left. I chose a university abroad deliberately. Specifically, I chose one where my father's network had minimal reach, where my last name would require explanation rather than producing automatic deference. I chose a school with an excellent economics program and a business school that rewarded demonstrated competency over legacy admission. I applied under my mother's maiden name. It was a calculated decision that took 3 months of research into what was and wasn't permissible. It was permissible. It required nothing illegal, only a legal name for admission materials. I wanted to know what I could build without the name, what I was without the infrastructure. My father did not speak to me for 6 months after I told him I wasn't taking financial support. My mother called twice in the first year, both times to report that my father was concerned, which I understood as code for confused by behavior that didn't align with expected parameters. I worked. I took a job in the university's data analysis center. I tutored. I lived in the smallest room in the cheapest building within a reasonable commute of campus. I ate plainly. I tracked every expenditure with a precision that became, over time, a kind of personal discipline rather than just necessity. I studied with a focus that had nothing to do with grades, though the grades came, and everything to do with genuine comprehension. I wanted to understand how capital moved, how it was accumulated, concentrated, deployed, how people without inherited wealth built leverage. I was particularly interested in the mechanisms through which power transferred between entities, not violently, not dramatically, but structurally. Contracts, shareholder agreements, board compositions, the quiet architecture of institutional authority. I made 2 friends in my first year, Isaac Wallace, who was studying law, and Melanie Carson, who was in finance. Neither of them knew anything about my family. I told them I was from a business family on the East Coast and that I was supporting myself through school. Both of these things were true. Neither of them prompted follow-up questions. Isaac, as it turned out, was one of the most analytically rigorous thinkers I had ever encountered. He approached legal problems the way mathematicians approach proofs, looking for the cleanest, most economical path to a correct conclusion. He was also deeply interested in corporate governance, in the mechanisms through which organizations were controlled, and how that control could be transferred, challenged, or removed. We spent 3 years talking. By the time I graduated, I had a master's in economics, a working understanding of corporate law that exceeded what most non-lawyers possessed, a small but genuine network of people who knew my work rather than my family name, and a clear-eyed view of exactly what I intended to build and why. I started small, deliberately small, a consultancy, just me and a part-time research assistant, focused on helping mid-sized companies analyze acquisition targets and identify structural vulnerabilities in their competitors' governance. I chose this niche because it was exactly the skill set I needed to develop for my own eventual purposes, and because it was billable. I was not an overnight success. I want to be specific about this because stories like mine tend to compress the middle, the long, flat section where nothing dramatic happens, and everything is just work and discipline and incremental progress. That section is real. It takes years. It is not photogenic. Year 1, 12 clients, modest revenue, 1 significant engagement with a regional investment firm that led to 2 referrals. Year 2, the consultancy became a company. I hired 2 analysts. I moved into a real office. The investment firm engagement produced a case study that I used carefully, strategically, to attract a slightly larger class of client. Year 3, I was approached by a private equity group that wanted independent governance analysis on a potential portfolio company. The engagement was complex, well compensated, and, most significantly, it put me in rooms with people who held genuine institutional authority. I studied those rooms. I studied the people in them. I learned what they responded to and what they dismissed. Year 4, I made my first direct investment, small, calculated, in a company I had analyzed thoroughly enough to understand its actual value versus its perceived value. The investment returned well. Year 5, the company had 15 employees, a legitimate client roster, and enough retained earnings that I no longer had to think carefully about the next 3 months. I started thinking about the next 3 years. Year 6, I met Eleanor again. I was in a conference room in a building downtown for a governance review meeting. I was presenting to a client's legal team. Their outside counsel had sent 3 attorneys. I was explaining a finding in the shareholder agreement that I believed created an unintended vulnerability in the event of a proxy contest. The attorney who responded first was the one who understood the finding. She asked 2 questions, the right questions, the questions that indicated not just familiarity with the document, but with the underlying legal architecture. Her second question was so precise that I paused for a half-second before answering, which I almost never do. I looked at her properly. She looked at me at the same time. The recognition was instantaneous and strange, not like seeing a ghost exactly, but like hearing a piece of music you know deeply after years of silence. Eleanor Blackwood, sitting across a conference table from me in a charcoal suit, with the same stillness she'd had at 17, now carrying professional authority in it, rather than just endurance. Neither of us said anything that acknowledged the recognition during the meeting. The meeting concluded. The legal team gathered their materials. She was last to stand. She said quietly, "I was wondering when something like this would happen." I said, "How long have you been back?" She said, 2 years. We had coffee that evening, 3 hours. I learned that she had cleared her father's name, entirely, not just provisionally, through a legal process that had taken 4 years and required uncovering procedural irregularities in how the original investigation had been initiated and managed. The firm handling the initial inquiry had failed to disclose a conflict of interest. A third party had provided documentation that turned out to be factually incorrect and potentially manufactured. Her father's company had been exonerated. The family had returned. She had gone to law school during the resolution process, working on her own case with the outside attorneys as a kind of extended clinic. She had joined a corporate litigation firm after passing the bar. She was, by the time I was sitting across from her, one of the more respected junior partners in her firm's governance practice. She told me all of this with the same directness she had always had. Economical, clear. No performance of triumph or residual bitterness, just information. Then she said, "During the process of clearing my father's case, we identified the mechanism that triggered the original reinvestigation." She was looking at me steadily. I said, "Tell me." The mechanism was clean in the specific way that my father did things, clean enough to be deniable, structured enough to be effective. A consulting firm connected to one of his holding companies had prepared and submitted a third-party audit referral to the investigating agency, the kind of referral that could trigger a review without requiring the referral source to be publicly identified. The consulting firm had since been dissolved. The paper trail required significant excavation to follow, but Eleanor's attorneys had followed it. The documentation she had was not courtroom ready. Not yet. The connections were demonstrable, but required additional corroborating evidence to constitute actionable proof of deliberate interference with a government investigation. Her firm was assessing the path forward. I listened to all of it. I asked clarifying questions. I asked about the specific chain of entities between my father's holding company and the consulting firm. I asked about the timeline and whether it corresponded to the window I remembered. The spring semester, the Thursday study, my father's study. Think carefully about what you're choosing. It corresponded exactly. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I want to help, not out of sentiment, out of precision." She studied me for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me what you mean by that." I told her what I'd spent 6 years building. I told her about the company, the client base, the governance expertise. I told her about the shareholder structure of my father's primary operating company, the one I had researched thoroughly over the years. Not because I had a plan yet, but because information about the entity that controlled your family's wealth was simply rational intelligence to maintain. I told her that the primary operating company had an interesting governance feature, a class of preferred shares held by minority institutional investors that carried specific rights in the event of a formal legal proceeding against the company's majority stakeholders. Rights that, if properly triggered, could require a governance review and potential restructuring of operational control. I told her that I held a small but not insignificant position in one of the institutional investors that held those preferred shares, a position I had acquired over 18 months through several intermediary entities, for reasons that I had told myself were investment-based, but now understood were something more specific. Eleanor listened to all of this without expression. Then she said, "You've been preparing for this without knowing what for." I said, "I think I've known what for. I just didn't have the other piece." She said, And now you do." We looked at each other across the coffee table. She said, "If we do this, we do it correctly. No shortcuts, no exposure, nothing that creates liability or compromises the legal record." I said, "Agreed." She said, "And we don't do it from anger." I said, "I haven't been angry in years. I've been patient." She considered that. Then she nodded once, the same nod she'd given me across the library table 9 years ago, when we'd reached an agreement about something. Some agreements, it turned out, had very long arcs. We spent 8 months building the strategy. Eleanor's firm formalized the legal track. She was not lead counsel for conflict reasons, but she was deeply involved in advising and in managing the evidentiary chain. A senior partner named Powell Davenport handled the official filing. The primary target was a formal complaint to the relevant agency's oversight board, documenting the procedural irregularities in the original Blackwood investigation and providing the chain of evidence connecting the third-party audit referral to entities controlled by my father's holding company. This was not a criminal filing. The evidence, though compelling, didn't meet the threshold for criminal prosecution of specific individuals. What it would produce, and this was the targeted outcome, was an administrative finding of impropriety in the original investigation. That finding would carry consequences for the entities involved, including potential civil liability and reputational damage. More specifically for our purposes, it would trigger the governance review provisions in the preferred share agreement. My role was the shareholder track. I worked through the institutional investor, whose position I held, to request a formal governance review of the operating company's board. I didn't do this alone. I spent 4 months building a coalition of like-minded shareholders who had their own concerns about the board's risk management practices. I presented the governance arguments on their merits, which were legitimate. I said nothing about personal history or family dynamics. I was precise, professional, and correct. By the time the legal track produced its first formal filing, I had commitments from shareholders representing roughly 31% of the preferred class. The governance review request required 25%. Isaac, my old friend from graduate school, now a practicing attorney with expertise in corporate governance, served as outside counsel on the shareholder side. He was aware of the personal history by this point, because I had told him everything 6 months into planning. He had listened carefully and then asked 3 questions. Was the governance case legitimate on its own merits? Was the legal evidence genuine and legally obtained? Were the targeted outcomes proportionate and legal? All 3, yes, he said. Then I'll help you. My father's attorneys, when they became aware of the combined legal and governance action, attempted to negotiate. 3 separate approaches in 4 months. The first was through an intermediary who reached out to my company offering a consulting engagement, an obvious attempt to create a conflict of interest. I declined without acknowledging the context. The second was a direct call from my father. The first time he had called me in 3 years. He was measured, controlled, almost entirely his normal self, which told me more than anything else could about the fact that he understood what was happening. He said he believed we had a misunderstanding worth discussing. I told him there was no misunderstanding, and that any further communication should go through my attorneys. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You've thought about this carefully." I told him yes. He hung up. The third approach came through my mother, who called to say that she was not sure I understood the full impact of what I appeared to be doing, and that she hoped I would reconsider. She said she knew things had been difficult. She said she missed me. I told her I missed the version of events in which none of this had been necessary. I told her I hoped she was well. I ended the call. The shareholders' assembly was held in April, 7 years after I had left for university, and 9 years after Eleanor had walked out of Thornfield Academy, cleared of false accusations. The room was what these rooms always are, a large conference space in a corporate law firm long table, mineral water, the specific quietness of people who understand that what happens in the next several hours will have legally binding consequences. My father was present with 2 attorneys. 3 members of his board were present. The institutional investors were represented by their counsels and by me, as the authorized representative of my shareholder coalition. Eleanor was not in the room. Her role had been completed months earlier. She had submitted her analysis, her recommendations, her evidentiary documentation to the appropriate bodies. She did not need to be here for the formal execution of what we had built. We had discussed this. She had said, "This part is yours, you know what to do." I did know what to do. I had prepared a presentation. It ran 47 minutes. I am not going to describe all of it here. What I will tell you is that it was methodical, documented, and unanswerable. I presented the governance case, the board's failure to maintain adequate conflict of interest protocols, the failure of the risk management framework, the pending administrative finding from the oversight body, which had been previewed in a preliminary report 2 weeks earlier, and the structural argument for a governance restructuring that would shift operational control of the primary division away from majority shareholder oversight and toward a professional management team with independent board oversight. I presented all of this in a measured professional tone. I did not editorialize. I did not reference personal history. I did not look at my father while I spoke. When I finished, the room was quiet for approximately 45 seconds. This is a long time in a room full of attorneys. One of my father's attorneys said that the governance claims were overstated. I responded with the specific provisions of the shareholder agreement that supported each claim and the page references for the relevant documentation. He had no substantive response. Another board member asked whether this action was motivated by personal considerations. I said that the action was motivated by the interests of the shareholders I represented, all of whom had been briefed fully on the legal and governance merits, and that those interests were a matter of record. I looked at my father once during that exchange. He was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to, I don't have a clean word for it. The recognition of a thing that has changed permanently. The expression of someone who has encountered the boundary of their own authority and found it is actually a boundary. He said nothing. The vote proceeded. The governance restructuring passed with the required threshold. Operational control of the primary division was transferred to an independent management committee pending a full board review. 3 board members, whose positions depended on majority shareholder alignment, submitted their resignations by end of day. I left the building at 4 p.m. The sky was overcast. The streets were ordinary. People were walking in both directions doing ordinary things. I sat in my car for a few minutes. Then I texted Eleanor. "Done." She responded, "I know. I've been following the docket." I smiled at my phone in a way that no one was there to see. Tyler Chambers, as it happened, had been working in my family's business for 4 years at this point. Placed there, I learned later, through my father's direct intervention, after Tyler's own career path had stalled. He was in a mid-level coordination role in the exact division that had just transferred to independent management. When the restructuring was finalized, the incoming management committee conducted a standard personnel review. Tyler's role was eliminated in the reorganization. I did not arrange this. I want to be specific about that. I had not targeted Tyler Chambers, had barely thought about Tyler Chambers in 9 years. The reorganization produced the outcome through its own structural logic. He was in a role that existed because of patron relationships that no longer existed. When the patronage ended, the role ended. Gavin Powell had already left the company 2 years prior. Chad Gibson had moved to a different industry entirely. Oliver Sanderson I had lost track of. The dismantling of the social structure we had occupied in high school had happened gradually over time. Through the ordinary attrition of people who never had much to hold them together, beyond shared geography and institutional convenience. My father retained his equity position, of course. He retained his title. What he lost was operational authority, the ability to direct, influence, and control the business he had spent 30 years managing. He remained a significant shareholder. He was not permitted to serve in any operational capacity while the pending administrative finding remained unresolved. He called me once more, 3 months after the assembly. I let it go to voicemail. He said he thought we should talk, that he thought there were things unsaid between us, that he was my father regardless of everything else. He said he hoped I understood that. I did understand that. He was my father. That was real. In whatever complicated and damaged way it was real. It was also true that he had used institutional power to destroy the family of someone I cared about, that he had done it deliberately and efficiently and without remorse, and that he had considered this a normal and acceptable exercise of his prerogatives. I didn't return the call. I did not return any subsequent calls. I instructed my attorney to communicate that all contact should be routed through counsel. There was a period of about 6 months where I expected to feel something clean and complete about all of this. Triumph, maybe, or release. Something with a shape. What I felt instead was more diffuse, a kind of settling, like a building that has been under structural stress for years, finally being allowed to rest at its actual grade. Eleanor and I did not have a dramatic romantic reunion. That is not what we were, or at least not only what we were. We had a long dinner in May, after everything had concluded, and we talked for 5 hours about everything that had happened, and everything we had built, and what came next. She told me about her work. She was planning to leave the firm and open her own practice focused on governance, litigation, and corporate compliance advisory. She had a client base. She had a reputation. She said she had been building toward independence for years and that the Blackwood case resolution, her own family's case, had given her a professional foundation she had not expected. I told her about the restructuring's aftermath. The incoming management team was competent. The administrative finding had produced civil proceedings that would run for years, but were unlikely to produce outcomes beyond financial penalties at this point. The company would continue. A lot of people's livelihoods depended on it continuing, and that was worth something. She asked how I was, not how the strategy was, how I was. I thought about it for a moment. I told her that I was functional, that I was productive, that I had built things I was genuinely proud of, that I was not sure those things had produced the feeling I had once, distantly, believed winning would produce, that I had been oriented toward this outcome for long enough that I wasn't entirely sure what I was oriented toward now. She said, "That's honest." I said, "I've found it's the most efficient approach." She smiled at that. The same smile contained, a little private, the smile of someone who has decided to allow themselves a small, specific pleasure. We were quiet for a moment. She said, "We did the right thing." I said, "We did the correct thing. I'm still figuring out the right thing." She nodded. She understood the distinction. We split the check. I walked her to her car. She said she would see me soon. I told her yes. 6 months later, we attended an industry event together. Not secretly. She was on the panel. I was in the audience. Afterward, we went to dinner with 3 of her colleagues and 2 of mine, and no one thought anything of it, and nothing needed to be explained or defended or managed. I'd spent the better part of a decade building leverage and positioning and strategic advantage, and here was the strangest consequence of all of it. An ordinary dinner where 2 people who had once had to hide in parking lots could simply occupy the same table in public without it costing anything. I looked at her across the table, talking with the person next to her, comfortable and precise and entirely herself. I thought about the girl who had eaten lunch alone in a school cafeteria and looked at a crumpled paper ball on her tray without flinching. The same person, the same stillness. But the context had shifted completely. We had shifted it ourselves. I walked to my car that night thinking about what my father had said, the last time I had seen him in person, that sentiment was a luxury people in our position could not afford. I had understood even then that he was wrong about this. Not because sentiment doesn't cost anything, it costs enormously, and I had paid the price in full, but because what you choose to pay the cost for is exactly what defines what kind of person you become. I had become someone I could not have predicted at 17, sitting in that plastic chair outside the vice principal's office. Someone harder in some ways, more careful, more capable of operating in rooms where the stakes are institutional, and the pressure is immense. Someone who can sit across a conference table from a man who shaped his entire childhood and speak to him only through counsel. I am not sure that person is better than the person I might have been in a different set of circumstances. I think about that occasionally, late when the work is done and the building is quiet, whether the cage was necessary to produce the tools that broke it. Whether you can build the kind of discipline I built without the particular quality of long, cold anger that built it. I don't have an answer. I have a company that employs 22 people. I have work that I believe is worth doing. I have one person in the world who knew me at 17 and knows me now and makes no distinction between those two people, which is the most unusual and particular gift I have ever received. What I know is this. The name on my company is not my father's name. The position I hold was not given to me. The authority I carry was built, piece by piece, in small offices and conference rooms, and quiet years of learning exactly what I needed to learn to do exactly what I intended to do. No one handed me that. No one can take it back. I stood in that shareholders' meeting and did the thing I had always intended to do, and it changed nothing about the past and everything about the future, and somewhere in the space between those two facts I continue to exist, functional, purposeful, and permanently different from who I was before I understood what things cost. The parking lot, the note, the plastic chair, the office where my father told me sentiment was a luxury. I think about all of them, not often, but clearly. Some things you carry not because they're heavy, but because you've decided they're worth the weight. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.